Margaret Thatcher's council home sell-off cost the taxpayer £200 billion. That's the conclusion of a new report from the Commonwealth think tank. That report has been picked up across the press, from The Guardian to The Telegraph, would you believe? The loss in local government wealth is down, they say, to the fact that council homes were sold off before house prices skyrocketed in the 1990s. So we sold them while they were cheap, and now they're really expensive. And because they were sold at a massive discount. So even at the time, people who bought their council home got 45% off the market price. Right? So this was clearly running down public assets, our assets. Commonwealth summarised the problem this created for local councils like this. They say, right to buy represents two big blows to council balance sheets: the discount giveaway itself and the foregone appreciation of the assets had they not been sold. So the discount being the 45% people got off of market price at the time, and then the foregone appreciation being how much house prices have risen since then. Of course, leaving councils out of pocket was probably more of a feature than a bug of Margaret Thatcher's sell-off of council homes, as she explained in Parliament when she was in power.
As the Honourable Gentleman is very well aware, we put through a policy of purchasing council houses by their tenants, a policy which was bitterly opposed by the Labour Party, a policy from which many, many people have profited and are very grateful for that. We shall continue to pursue that policy, and in Scotland, as he knows, it's gone further to Scottish homes. It has been a very good bargain for all who have partaken of the opportunity they've had from this government.
Now, Thatcher is right. It was a bargain for the people who bought their council homes, but it was a bargain at the expense of central government, who now spend billions every year on housing benefits that go to private landlords. And it was a bargain that now threatens to bankrupt local councils. Now, that's because councils still have the responsibility to house low-income families, but have no housing stock to put them in. As a result, they spend over £2 billion a year on emergency temporary accommodation. Again, while this is a loss for the taxpayer and these families who are denied a stable home, it's a big win for the private landlords who get a stable income from local authorities to provide often substandard homes. It's all rather frustrating, but is there any hope of us going back to a system that actually works? Well, earlier today, I spoke to a good friend of mine and the Cabinet Member for Housing in Wandsworth Council, Aidan Dickadem. I started by asking him about his response to the calculations made by Commonwealth.
Well, I thought it was an excellent report, and I really recommend people going away and reading it. I think there are two things that really stand out. One is obviously the emphasis on the opportunity costs to the state, to the British people, of what this mass privatisation has kind of led to, particularly in the context of the current economic crisis and also the housing crisis. And I think they paint the history of how successive terrible things happened post right to buy. I think the second important thing is the interrogation of the ideological the ideological explanation is probably the wrong word, justification of right to buy as a redistributive policy. Because within the cohort of people that benefited from right to buy, they go into how it was actually less progressive and less redistributive than is often argued by people who still are proponents of right to buy and the kind of redistributive value that it had. So I think it's a really, really useful report. And it also kind of, in some ways it's depressing, because I think for most people, they know that right to buy has led to basically has been like catastrophic in terms of its real world impact. And I think by looking at that, we can start to think about the broader ramifications in terms of public ownership, in terms of the public good.
And I mean, you're in a very practical role here. You're responsible for housing in Wandsworth. So I would assume you have a long waiting list of people who want a council home. You've got to try and distribute them between, I suppose, the limited supply of council homes or social homes that you control access to. I mean, do you know sort of how many more homes you'd have to play with if right to buy hadn't been in place? Do you know how many homes were sold off in Wandsworth?
Yeah, so we'll never quite know the full figures, but I can tell you some specific examples. So of the stock that I manage, 17,500 are socially rented units and about 15,000 are leasehold properties that were sold under right to buy. But that doesn't include the thousands of street properties and whole estates that were privatized. So we think roughly in the ballpark figure of about 30,000 social homes were sold overall. Now, so within that stock profile that I manage, of the 15,000 that are now leasehold properties, about half are non-resident landlords. So they are now private rental properties. I think there are two really good examples from Wandsworth, right? Because Wandsworth in many ways is like, it's Thatcher's favourite council. And it's the birthplace of some of the kind of reforms and policies that led to right to buy. We were kind of pioneers in that, right? So, Winstanley York Road estate, when I was growing up, one of the kind of worst places to grow up in the country, I think 0.1%, worst places in terms of life outcomes and chances. Very much created because the entire Falklands estate was privatised en masse. So an entire estate, not sold under right to buy, but given over to a private developer, led to a gated community that cut that estate off from Falkland Road. So there are kind of other implications from this privatisation in terms of the fabric of our communities, in terms of the geography of them. A second really kind of like classic example is the son of the Minister for Housing under Thatcher owns about 40 plus council units in Wandsworth. He's a mass landlord. So you've kind of got almost like a direct link between who are the beneficiaries of this policy and who are the losers. And I think that's, again, one of the great things about this report is it goes into the historical detail. Also, some of the missed opportunities to kind of mitigate some of the impacts of right to buy. Because, in some ways, the irony is, of course, that Thatcher aimed to create this property-owning democracy, this property-owning majority. And actually, we've ended up in probably the opposite of that, which is a small group of people owning quite a lot and everyone else, including the state, having to rent that back off them. So it's kind of like a Frankenstein of the original idea in many ways.
The sell-off of council homes, I think, has had two impacts on different parts of the state, right? So when it comes to the central state or central government who pay housing benefit, it means that potentially they're spending more on housing benefit than they otherwise would going to private landlords, some of them, as you say, who have bought up ex-council properties. As far as I understand, for you, so for the council, your big responsibility is housing people who are in desperate need of housing, and the cost to you goes on emergency or temporary accommodation. Let me know if I've got that wrong, but also if I've got that right, sort of, can you expand on what it means that you have people who you have to provide emergency accommodation for when you've got no council homes to put them in?
Yeah, so in 2010, Wandsworth had about 400 families in temporary accommodation, and that's a statutory responsibility where if someone maybe gets served a Section 21 or they face family breakdown or they're evicted because their private landlord wants to sell up, they can come to the council, particularly if they're on a low income, and we have a duty to find them some housing. Now, what we have seen since 2010 is a kind of catastrophic explosion of this need for temporary accommodation because rents went up, benefit was capped, and London Housing Allowance, a particular sort of housing benefit, was frozen. And so you had all these people who, for a while, kind of during the Blair eras, had been able to hold on to a kind of low cost private rental, started to face mass exodus from that PRS system, but there was no social housing to place them in. And so we ended up with this temporary accommodation middle ground, which is basically the mass transfer of wealth from the public sector into the private sector. London councils, at the last estimate, are spending about £4 million a day on temporary accommodation. Often this is poor quality accommodation, and often it is ex-council accommodation that we are spending huge amounts, sometimes at market or above market if it's nightly paid. It is the market, but the market is totally rigged. So this is really the kind of sharp end of the chaos that right to buy has led to. I think the one thing that I'd like to see more reporting on, because the focus of Commonwealth, understandably, is the kind of macroeconomic impact and the kind of opportunity cost of that asset class, right? That asset class from the public purse, from public ownership. But I think the cost is much higher when you factor in the health implications, the education implications, the employment implications that poor quality housing has created and that the housing crisis has led to. I mean, I think that is a much larger sum when we actually add it all up, and a kind of human tragedy as well.
So I suppose the way we're talking about this is this sort of historic mistake So Margaret Thatcher decided that she wanted to sell off council homes, probably for cynical political reasons, because she thought that homeowners would be more likely to vote Tory than council tenants. But, someone watching this might be thinking, this is ancient history. What about now? You're a Labour council in what you've said was, it had been a Tory council for decades, had been Margaret Thatcher's favourite council, but now Labour are in charge. Labour are also in charge nationally. Is anything being done to reverse this situation? I know I see on your Instagram every now and again, you're sort of showing these new council homes that have got built in your borough. But I mean, is that a drop in the ocean? Tell me about the direction of travel now.
Yeah, so we're building a new generation of council housing in Wandsworth, and this is direct build by the council. But on the question, which we often get asked, is, well, you're building this council housing, isn't it all just going to get sold off under right to buy? And there are two. Before the Labour government, we had a kind of plan for that, which was actually, because of how hot the property market is in London, the market cost of the new council homes, because of the quality of these council homes that we're building, was so high that even with the discount, it was unlikely that someone who would qualify on a low income into that council housing would be able to qualify under right to buy for a long time. Like, it would, just because of how high spec is and how expensive the market is. That was our kind of buffer we were hoping, but that wasn't going to last for a long time. The Labour government has actually, and credit to them, although they said they weren't going to scrap right to buy because it's still very popular, they have in many ways limited its reach almost to the point at which I can't see it becoming a major issue in terms of supply, because they've extended the period in which you have to reside in the property. They've reduced the discount massively to about 5%, with a staircasing on 1% every time you live there. And they've taken new builds out of it to protect the kind of new build council housing that we're building. So just like in 2012, when the Tories came in, they kind of re-implemented a kind of turbocharged right to buy. And for that whole decade in which the temporary accommodation crisis was happening, we were losing more homes to right to buy and demolition than we were building. The Labour government has actually transformed right to buy to the point at which I think there will be much fewer sales than there has been for the last 15 years.
Okay, that's good. That's good on right to buy. I suppose the issue that viewers might be asking is, in terms of how are we turning this around, is how many council homes are you building? So my understanding, I suppose from how we've spoken before, is you're building sort of 1,000 council homes over a term, which...
submitting planning for 1,000 in the term, build out probably about 8 years. But the aim is 1,000. We'll most certainly get over 1,000. But people say, well, Aidan, your waiting list is 14,000. I say, okay, 1,000 homes is probably 5,000 people, maybe more, because of households and how many people can occupy those homes. But and that, what a greater honour than to have changed the lives of 5,000 plus people. Like, that's why you get into this. But you're right, we have to negotiate from private sites in Section 106. And for those who are watching, Section 106 is the affordable housing percentages that we argue from developers. And that's where a lot of the pipeline of housing, social housing, has to come through. And in Wandsworth, again, we're trying to make it so that we've got planning changes coming through the system where we try and make sure that as much social housing is delivered on those private sites. There was lots of coverage about the spending review. I mean, that was a welcome change. That was finally going back to pre-crash levels of funding for social housing. But there is a huge amount of ground to cover. Like, the report outlines, roughly a third of people were living in social housing in 1980, and that was halved by right to buy. Now, in council housing, that went even down. That's down to 6% now. Because housing associations make up a large bulk of that. So, the project that I see myself as part of is trying to, be part of that political movement that is fighting for a world in which people like me and you can get access to council housing, social housing again, because it is plentiful, because it is abundant, right? And that is the world we have to fight for. But, we're starting from a very low base because of 15 years of the same logics that led to right to buy, like austerity and privatization.
And I suppose being more ambitious here. So say if you think about sort of like politicians in the 50s and the 60s, even Tory ones, actually, they were building like 200,000 council homes a year. And obviously to do that, it's not going to be based on like a few cabinet members in various councils who are committed to council housing. That would have to be a central government commitment. So would it be the case that if sort of Rachel Reeves says, actually, this is worth it, we're going to put £100 billion into local authorities to build council homes, could you very rapidly just double the amount of council homes you're building? Would it be a sort of sensible demand to say to this Labour government, you need to give local councils billions of pounds so that they can build out homes which not only provide homes for people, but also a sort of an asset which the state can start to build out, so the state owns stuff again?
Yeah, there's 2 points there. There's one, your historical point about how there was a historical consensus on council housing prior to Thatcher. Thatcherism, right to buy, it changed the social fabric of reality. Like, I think we can't underestimate it. Like, changed our brains. It changed the way that we think about the world. There are amazing interviews from the 1970s on Parkinson where like conservatives are arguing housing positions that would be seen as like, to the left of Corbyn. Like it was just a different era because people thought exploitation and landlordism were bad and that there should be rent controls. That was kind of the norm, right? So there's pushing back to that agenda and trying to build popular consensus around that. The point about the ambition, right? I think for anyone who cares about council housing, there's a strong argument for any government that's trying to make savings on welfare that at the moment this system is really, really bad in regards to huge public subsidies of private interests. So there are savings to be made on the housing benefit bill, on the temporary accommodation bill. So there's an articulation that speaks to some of the challenges that a national government faces. There is an issue with interest rates. It breaks my heart that the kind of golden era of low interest rates was occupied by a Conservative government, because that does mean that borrowing to build council housing has become a longer term investment, but it still pays for itself. You just have to extend the lifetime of the borrowing period. It pays for itself in the end, and then it generates income. So I think it's a worthwhile asset that governments should invest in. I think we're in an interesting place. The spending review showed that there is clearly a desire for council housing and social housing to be returned to the tenure type, at least get as close to it. I know Angela Rayner has said that she wants to become the second largest tenure type, and so I think it's incumbent on all of us to fight for that. The challenge we face, and we've discussed it many times, is electorally the coalition of young renters at the moment who are really squeezed can't foresee the world in which they get access to council housing, and the YIMBY movement has been very good at trying to curb them off and argue for more market liberalisation and reforms, because it says, why should you have to suffer? It's creating a new kind of class politics in which young professional renters are pitted against social tenants. We have to absolutely fight against that kind of binary. I think one way to do that is to make life easier for private renters with rent controls, long-term secure tenancies. The Renters' Rights Bill will add towards that. But, those are the fissures that we've talked about quite a lot.
That was Aidan Dickadem speaking to me earlier today. Helena, I want your thoughts on the sell-off of council housing and the news that it's potentially cost us £200 billion.
I think we need to start with a rhetorical shift, insofar as rather than describing it as right to buy or the sell-off of council homes, call it housing privatisation. People don't like the word privatisation. There's one thing that you can get people in this country to be negatively polarised towards something. It is describing it as privatisation. No one likes it. It keeps getting foisted upon us continuously by governments. Don't know what's happening with my camera, by the way, sorry. We continually get foisted upon us by government after government after government, the continual privatisation of the assets of the country. Yeah, people don't like it, and so we should be trying to negatively polarize people towards right to buy by framing it as such. In terms of how do we solve this problem of lack of council housing inventory, now I'm glad that the Greater London Authority is broadly in favour of the right to buy back, i.e. giving councils the freedom to be able to compete in the private market for taking private houses off the market and turning them into council housing. That's a really good scheme that should be expanded across the country. In terms of giving councils competitive advantage, we need community right to buy, which was kind of a Lisa Nandy idea, to have like historic pubs or whatever be able to be bought by local authorities. It needs to be expanded to basically all private residential housing at this point to ensure that the council itself has the right of first refusal when these things come onto the market. So far, that means that they aren't trying to essentially drive demand up, which actually drive up house prices if they're just competing as normal with members of the public as well for the same very small supply of new private housing. And what we need to do is we actually need to look in terms of state provision of the actual construction of new council housing to try and get people bought into the idea that the state can do things. Insofar as at the moment, if you really do want to get council houses built, you rely on Homes England to tender a contract. And Homes England is just essentially a quango that bids for contracts for private developers to be able to build social houses for them. So you therefore entrusting with the construction of what should be long-term projects into what are the definitely pretty controversial and shoddy building practices of the private developer market. I'm not going to name any companies that might apply to, but we all know the ones, don't we? We all know who that applies to. And so what we need is a public developer. We need the state to actually own a development company that it can tender contracts to without having to pay for profits, without having to pay for CEO and directorial salaries as well, to make sure that we're doing it at cost, and that these contracts can be tendered immediately without having to worry about these private developers thinking about going elsewhere because they get a better deal to do it on private land they've bought themselves. Have a public developer, have it there to be able to engage in contracts from Homes England, or you could scrap Homes England as a quango and just have it directly coming out of the Housing and Local Government Department in government from the ministerial position, and then use that immediately to have councils access to a developer that's on the phone immediately to come and develop land as soon as it's acquired by the council. And we can get people, again, bought into the idea that the state can do things. It's not all private contracts. It's not all consultancies. It's not all somebody passing the buck on to somebody else. And if they get it wrong, wasn't my fault, it was the quango or the private company. No. Get the state doing these things. We can get around a bunch of regulation in terms of judicial reviews because it's the state doing it rather than a private developer being a middleman. And suddenly we can actually look at new towns, new council estates, and trying to make sure that the state does these things all over again. Because clearly this private developer-led model hasn't worked.